I never thought that the quiet of my house would become so oppressive, yet here I am, 76 years old, living in the same little bungalow where my wife and I once laughed at midnight over burnt pancakes, where we hosted Christmas dinners that smelled of cinnamon and pine, where we dreamed together about old age as if it would be some gentle season of companionship. Now the walls echo with nothing but the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of a clock that seems far louder than it ever was when Lavina was alive. Mornings are the hardest. I wake at 6, like I always did when I had work, though I have been retired for more than a decade. There is no reason to rise early except that my body has not learned how to sleep in, and perhaps also because my heart carries the habit of expecting someone beside me, someone who would stir, roll over, and whisper that the coffee was ready. That voice has been gone for 9 years, and yet each morning when I reach across the bed, my hand still instinctively searches the cool, empty space. I get up slowly, every bone reminding me of time's cruelty, shuffle to the kitchen, measure out the grounds and water with the precision of an accountant who no longer has ledgers, but still clings to ritual. I drink my coffee at the small wooden table by the window, looking out at the street where children ride bicycles that I no longer recognize, because they grow too quickly while I seem frozen in place. I tell myself that I am not entirely alone. I have a daughter, Claire, and once upon a time, she was the little girl who colored crayon hearts for my birthday, the one who danced on my shoes while I played Sinatra on the old record player, the one who clutched my hand so tightly when she was frightened that I thought she would never let go. Those memories live in me as vividly as if they happened yesterday, though to her they seem to belong to a distant, irrelevant past. Children grow, they move on, they forget the sacrifices you made. They tell themselves different stories about their childhood to justify the distance they now keep. I know this in my head, but my heart has not adjusted, and it still waits for her to walk through the door with a smile and a casual, "Hi, Dad. Thought I'd stop by." That door remains closed more often than not. The days blur into one another with a rhythm of small tasks that are meant to keep me sane. Sweep the porch, trim the bushes, pay the bills, walk slowly to the grocery store where the cashier knows my name, but not my story. I nod to neighbors, though they are mostly younger families, polite but hurried, their lives full of soccer practices and mortgage payments. Sometimes, when I sit on the front steps and hear their voices drifting through the evening air, I wonder if they look at me as just another old man who failed to move on, who lingers in a house that ought to be sold, who takes up space in a neighborhood that wants freshness and vitality. I try not to let such thoughts stay too long, but they creep in when the nights are quiet, when the phone doesn't ring, and when the silence of being unneeded feels heavier than the arthritis in my knees. I tell myself that my daughter is busy, that she has her own children, that life for people in their 40s is demanding. I excuse her absences by repeating that phrase again and again. She's busy, until it sounds like a prayer muttered by someone trying to convince himself that faith still exists. Yet there is a part of me that knows better, that recognizes avoidance not as busyness, but as a choice. In rare moments when she does call, her voice is clipped, hurried, and tinged with a sharpness that surprises me, as if she resents the obligation of even that small gesture. We used to talk about everything, her school exams, the boys who broke her heart, the books she read. Now she asks if I've taken my medication, if I'm keeping up with my bills, and then quickly segues into complaints about her own expenses, her children's tuition, the rising cost of everything. I answer patiently, as though I am still the father who can fix things, though deep down I know she does not call for comfort but for calculation, weighing what she can still extract from the man who once believed his role was to provide endlessly. My birthday approaches every year like a date carved in stone, something that once brought excitement, laughter, and gatherings, but now carries the sting of anticipation met with disappointment. I still remember the last time the whole family came over. It was my 70th, a milestone, the dining room filled with chatter, the grandchildren running in circles, Lavina smiling at me across the table as if to say, "See, we made it. We are loved." It was the last birthday she saw, and maybe the last one that truly felt like a celebration. Since then, the day passes quietly, sometimes with a card purchased at the last minute, sometimes with a perfunctory call that lasts less than 2 minutes. Each year I tell myself not to expect anything, to treat it as just another day. Yet expectation is a stubborn guest that never leaves. And so the sting renews itself annually. This year, perhaps because the number feels heavier, 76, it presses on me with unusual weight. I find myself remembering childhood birthdays when my mother would bake a chocolate cake, simple but sweet, and I would feel like the center of the universe, if only for a day. I remember the years when Claire was small, when she would tiptoe into our bedroom at dawn, shaking a badly wrapped gift and shouting, "Happy birthday, Daddy!" I remember the years when Lavina would plan a surprise, even though she knew I disliked surprises, just to make me smile, to remind me that life was worth celebrating, no matter how ordinary the days had become. Those memories haunt me as much as they comfort me, because they make the present contrast so brutally clear. Lately, I have begun to notice how people's eyes slide past the elderly, how society itself pretends that once you are old, you are invisible. In the grocery store, younger shoppers brush past me impatiently. At the bank, the teller raises her voice unnecessarily, assuming my ears are failing. At family gatherings, on the rare occasions I am included, I become furniture, someone to nod at politely, but not to engage with. My daughter herself sometimes speaks to me in that same tone, as though addressing a stubborn child, rather than a man who carried her on his shoulders, who paid for her college education, who sat by her hospital bed when she had pneumonia at 12. I do not say these things out loud. Pride prevents me. But they echo inside me whenever she sighs on the phone, or avoids meeting my eyes when we do sit across from each other. I suppose loneliness makes you replay the past too often. I find myself walking through old photo albums, touching the images as though the people could return if I pressed hard enough. I hear Lavina's laugh and the clatter of dishes when I make my solitary dinner. I recall Claire's little voice ask me to push her higher on the swing, the way she once believed that I was strong enough to touch the sky for her. Perhaps I cling too hard to what was, and in doing so, I blind myself to what is. But then, what is left for an old man if not memory? When the future shrinks to the length of your shadow in the afternoon sun, the past becomes your only companion, and yet it is also the cruelest, because it shows you how much you have lost. As my 76th birthday approaches, I find myself bargaining with fate in small ways. I tell myself that if she calls, if she remembers me with something simple, I will let go of all the resentments. I will forgive the distance. I will not ask for anything more. Just a cake, perhaps, nothing fancy, a small symbol that I am still her father, that I still matter. I clean the house in preparation, though I tell myself it is just routine. I buy an extra carton of milk, as if someone might come over. I even polish the good plates that have not been touched since Lavina's passing, a ridiculous act, but I do it anyway. Somewhere deep inside, despite all evidence, hope flickers stubbornly, and that is where I stand, a man who has lived through wars, recessions, and the death of the woman he loved, yet trembles now at the thought of whether his own daughter will bring him a cake on his birthday, or whether she will confirm what I already fear, that I am no longer needed, no longer respected, no longer truly loved. The phone rang on the afternoon before my birthday, a sound that startled me more than it should have, because the house had grown accustomed to silence. I glanced at the caller ID and saw Claire's name, and for a brief, foolish moment, my heart lifted as if something was about to be restored, as if she had remembered that I was still her father, as if she might be calling to say that she was on her way with the grandchildren, that they were baking something in the kitchen, that perhaps, just perhaps, this birthday would not pass unnoticed. I answered quickly, forcing a brightness into my voice that I rarely felt any more. "Claire," I said, "how nice to hear from you." On the other end there was a pause, a sigh, and then her voice came, sharp, clipped, and edged with a kind of contempt that cut through me like a cold wind. "Dad, I wanted to call before tomorrow," she began, and for a heartbeat I thought it was a prelude to kindness until she continued, "But don't expect anything. You don't deserve a birthday cake, not after everything." The word stunned me. I actually pulled the receiver away from my ear, staring at it as though the phone itself had betrayed me, as though perhaps I had misheard. "What do you mean?" I asked softly, my throat tight. She laughed, not warmly, but with bitterness. "Exactly what I said. You don't deserve to be celebrated. You never earned it. Not with the way you treated Mom, not with the way you've treated me. You've spent your life pretending to be some noble martyr, but really you were selfish, controlling, and impossible. Do you really think a cake fixes all of that?" My knees weakened, and I sat heavily at the kitchen table, staring at the patterns of scratches in the wood that had been carved by decades of use. I remembered Lavina's hand smoothing a tablecloth there, remembered Claire's crayons scattered across it when she was small, remembered long evenings of conversation. Now the same table became the stage of humiliation, as my daughter's voice poured accusations that I could not defend myself against because they were not entirely about facts, but about twisted interpretations of a life shared. "You were never there for me," she continued, her tone rising. "When I needed support, you gave lectures. When I needed understanding, you gave me money, as if that solved anything. Do you know what it felt like to live with you and Mom always playing the perfect couple while I was just in the way? You think because you paid bills and sat in your chair after work that you were a good father? No, Dad. You were absent. You were cold. And Mom deserved better than what she got." I gripped the phone, trembling, because every word was like being flayed alive. Lavina had never once said she was unhappy. She had been my companion, my confidant, and to hear my own child rewrite that history felt like a betrayal of memory itself. I tried to respond, my voice breaking. "Claire, that's not true. Your mother and I loved each other. We loved you." But she cut me off sharply. "Stop lying to yourself. She told me things you'll never admit, things about how lonely she was, how you never really listened, how you only cared about being respected, about looking good. You don't deserve a cake, Dad. You don't deserve anything. So don't sit around tomorrow waiting for me, because I won't be there. And you should finally understand that it's your own fault." There was a silence after her words, and I could hear my own breathing, ragged, uneven, the sound of a man who had just been told his existence was worthless. I wanted to protest, to defend myself, to remind her of the countless nights I worked overtime, to make sure she could go to college, of the hospital visits, the times I held her when she cried after her first heartbreak, the sacrifices that I never once complained about. But what would be the point? She had rewritten the story, and in her version, I was the villain. I whispered, "Claire, please, it's my birthday. I don't need gifts. I don't need anything. Just a call, just some kindness." My words sounded pathetic even to me, and she laughed again. That bitter, humorless laugh that told me I was not speaking to the little girl I remembered, but to a stranger who bore her name. "You don't get to beg for kindness now," she said. "You should have thought of that years ago. Goodbye." And with that, the line went dead. I sat there for a long time, the receiver still in my hand, as if waiting for the sound of her voice to return, as if the silence might be broken by a confession that it was all just a cruel joke, a test, anything but reality. The house felt colder than ever, and I realized I was shaking, not just from age, but from something deeper. Shock, grief, rage all twisted together. The words, "You don't deserve a cake," replayed again and again in my head. Not because of the cake itself, but because of what it symbolized. The denial of acknowledgement, the denial of my role as father, the erasure of everything I had lived for. A birthday cake is a child's simplest gift to a parent, a gesture that says, "You matter. I am glad you were born." To be told I did not deserve, even that was to be told, that my life, my sacrifices, my very existence were worthless. That night I walked the house in circles, touching the photographs on the wall as though they could defend me, as though the smiling faces frozen in frames could argue with her accusations. Here was Claire at 5, beaming with chocolate smeared on her face from the very birthday cakes she once delighted in baking with her mother. Here was Lavina in her garden, holding a bouquet of roses, her eyes lit with joy that no words of loneliness had ever betrayed. Here was the family trip to Yellowstone, where we laughed at the rain soaking through our jackets. Were these people all lies? Had I imagined the love we shared? Or was my daughter's bitterness simply too deep, rewriting the truth into something darker so that she could justify the distance, justify the requests for money, justify the coldness? I did not know. All I knew was that my birthday had already been poisoned before it arrived. When I finally collapsed into bed, I lay staring at the ceiling, unable to close my eyes. I thought of how absurd it was that a man who had faced loss and hardship could be undone by a simple phone call, and yet that is the nature of wounds inflicted by family. They cut where strangers cannot. I wondered if tomorrow I should ignore the day completely, treat it like any other, or if I should acknowledge it in my own way. Not because my daughter believed I deserved nothing, but because I had to remind myself that I was still here, that my life had value beyond her judgment. Yet even as I told myself that, I knew I would wake with the same pit in my stomach, knowing that the only child I had looked at me not as a father, but as a man unworthy of the simplest kindness. And so the catalyst was set. A phone call that turned what should have been a gentle day of remembrance into a declaration of rejection. The kind of rejection that forces a man to question not only his past, but the very meaning of his existence. The morning of my birthday arrived with the same pale light spilling through the curtains, but instead of the quiet anticipation that had lingered in me in past years, there was only a heaviness, a sense that the day had been robbed before it began. I rose slowly, every movement accompanied by the ache of joints that no longer obeyed as they once had, and I shuffled to the kitchen, telling myself that I would not let Claire's words dictate how I felt. Yet they followed me like a shadow, every step echoing with the memory of her voice telling me I did not deserve even the smallest token of celebration. I tried to brush it away, tried to pour the coffee with steady hands, tried to spread the butter on toast as though it were an ordinary day. But nothing felt ordinary. Even the clock seemed louder, ticking like a countdown to nothing, reminding me of the emptiness of the hours ahead. By mid-morning, the silence in the house had grown unbearable, so I decided, almost impulsively, to go out. There was a small bakery 2 blocks away, one that Lavina had always loved. The kind of place where the glass cases gleamed with rows of pastries dusted in sugar, and where birthdays had once meant ordering a cake large enough to feed family, neighbors, and friends. I had not stepped inside for years, perhaps because I could not face the ghosts of memories it carried. But something pushed me there that morning. Maybe it was defiance, maybe desperation, maybe the stubborn hope that I could salvage the day in some small way. When I opened the door, the bell above it chimed, and the sweet smell of baked bread and frosting wrapped around me, both comforting and cruel. The young woman behind the counter smiled automatically, a practiced politeness, and asked if she could help me. My voice shook slightly as I said I wanted a cake, something small, nothing fancy. She pointed out a few simple ones, chocolate, vanilla lemon, and I chose the chocolate because it reminded me of the cakes my mother baked when I was a boy. As she boxed it up, she asked if it was for a celebration, and for a moment I hesitated, caught between truth and lie. Finally, I admitted, "It's my birthday." She smiled again, said "Happy birthday," in that cheerful but impersonal way strangers do, and slid the box toward me. I thanked her, paid, and walked out carrying the weight of that box as though it were a fragile piece of dignity I was determined not to let slip. Back home, I set the cake on the table and stared at it. The absurdity of the situation struck me. I was a 76-year-old man buying his own birthday cake because his only daughter had declared him undeserving of one. I lit a single candle I'd found in the drawer, left over from years past, and I sat alone at the table, watching the flame flicker. For a long moment, I could not bring myself to blow it out. It felt childish, foolish, almost humiliating. But then I closed my eyes and made a wish. Not for wealth, not for health, not for anything grand, but simply for peace. Peace from the bitterness of my daughter's voice. Peace from the weight of disappointment. Peace from the gnawing loneliness that consumed me. I blew out the candle, the smoke curling into the air, and I cut myself a slice, tasting chocolate and memory and something bitter that no sugar could mask. I thought that would be the end of it, that I would put the cake away and let the day dissolve into silence. But fate had another turn prepared. Around noon, my phone buzzed with a message. For an instant, hope flared. Perhaps Claire had reconsidered. Perhaps she would soften her words. Perhaps she would at least send me a note of civility. But when I opened it, the words on the screen made my heart sink deeper than before. "By the way," she wrote, "I need $10,000 this week. My car is about to be repossessed, and I can't deal with this right now. You know you've always helped before. Don't make me beg. Just transfer it today." No happy birthday, no acknowledgement of the day at all. Just a demand, as though my only purpose was to continue feeding her bottomless well of needs. I sat staring at the screen, feeling something shift inside me. Something that had been dormant, but was stirring awake. For years, I had said yes to everything. Tuition bills, mortgage help, credit card debt, vacations she claimed she needed for her mental health. I had written check after check, telling myself that was what fathers did, that providing was an act of love, that maybe someday she would see it as such and respond with gratitude. But gratitude had never come. Instead, there was always another request, another crisis, another reason why I had to sacrifice so she could maintain a life that seemed perpetually unstable. I felt the weight of all those years pressing on me as I read her message again. On the very day she told me I did not deserve a cake, she also demanded money, as if my worth could only be measured in dollars and never in love. I did not reply, not immediately. Instead, I walked to the desk in the corner of the living room, pulled open the drawer, and took out the old folders I had kept, thick with receipts, statements, and notes. I spread them across the table, and as I flipped through them, I began to see the pattern with a clarity I had long ignored. Here was the check for her first car, written 25 years ago. Here was the tuition payment for graduate school. Here was the contribution for the down payment on the house she later sold, without so much as inviting me to step inside. Here were the credit card bills she had accidentally racked up, the medical expenses she claimed insurance would not cover, the endless small withdrawals that had eaten away at the savings I once thought would carry me comfortably through old age. I added the numbers roughly in my head, and the total staggered me. Hundreds of thousands over the years, all given without hesitation, all justified in the name of love. And yet here I was, alone, accused and dismissed. The more I looked at the papers, the more my hands trembled, not from weakness, but from anger, an anger I had not allowed myself to feel until now. It was as though a veil had been lifted, and I saw my relationship with Claire not as a bond of love, but as a long pattern of manipulation and dependence. She did not call to share her life, to bring me joy, or even to offer companionship. She called when she needed, and when she did not need, she disappeared. And when I hoped for something as simple as a cake, she turned it into a weapon, a reminder that my only value to her was financial. I stared at the text again, the demand for $10,000, and for the first time in years, I felt no compulsion to respond. I put the phone down, closed the folders, and sat back in my chair, breathing heavily as though I had just walked miles. Something inside me whispered that this had to end, that if I continued to give, I would die not only poorer, but emptier, stripped of dignity, erased by the very child I had once carried in my arms. The first escalation had arrived, and it was not just in her cruelty, but in my awakening. For the first time, I understood that saying no was not selfishness, but survival, that perhaps I still had the power to reclaim the fragments of respect she had long denied me. The afternoon sun dipped lower, casting shadows across the room, and I sat there staring at them as though they were symbols of the years passing. I realized that if I did nothing, if I sent her the money again, I would be confirming her view that I deserved nothing more than to be used. And so I sat in that heavy silence, my birthday cake untouched on the table, my phone buzzing again with her impatient follow-up, and I felt the storm gathering in my chest. The humiliations had begun to pile too high, and I knew something in me was about to break, not into despair, but into defiance. That evening, after hours of pacing through the house as if the walls themselves were pressing inward, I returned to the kitchen and looked again at the half-finished cake, its frosting already stiffening under the plastic wrap. It struck me then with a kind of brutal clarity that the cake was not just dessert, but a mirror reflecting back everything I had been refusing to admit, that I had been celebrating alone for years while pretending that things might change, that I had been living on scraps of hope while my daughter had long since moved on, except when she needed me to rescue her. I sat down, cut myself another slice, and ate it slowly, each bite a mixture of sweetness and bitterness, until I finally put the fork down and said aloud, to no one, "This ends tonight." The words startled me, because they sounded firm, like a vow, like something that had been lodged in my throat for years, but was only now finding its voice. Later that night, when the phone buzzed again, I half expected another demand, another accusation. But what I saw was worse in its indifference. A short message from Claire reading, "Don't forget the transfer. I'm counting on you." Not even a question mark, not even the politeness of a request, just an assumption of obedience. I stared at those words and felt a weight pressing on my chest. And in that moment, I realized that the relationship was no longer a relationship at all. It had become a transaction, a one-way siphoning of resources and patience. The love had been drained from it long ago, and all that remained was obligation, one-sided and suffocating. I knew then that if I gave in once more, I would confirm the story she had written about me. The story that said I was weak, guilty, undeserving, and only useful for my money. The following morning, as the sunlight crept across the floorboards, I opened the desk drawer again and retrieved the thick envelope where I had kept all my financial documents. My fingers traced the edges of bank statements, check stubs, and insurance forms like a priest touching sacred texts, and I began to read them not with the resignation of habit, but with the eyes of a man searching for liberation. I saw clearly, perhaps for the first time, the arithmetic of my downfall. Decade after decade of withdrawals, transfers, loans disguised as gifts. The constant erosion of security that I had once promised myself and Lavina would keep us comfortable. Until the end, she was gone, and all that remained of her legacy was being devoured by the one person who should have honored it. That realization struck like lightning, searing away the fog of denial. I told myself that if Lavina were alive, she would have demanded I stop, that she would have reminded me that love is not proven by endless sacrifice to those who no longer respect you. It was then that I made a decision so stark it frightened me. I would no longer be her provider, not in the way she demanded, not at the cost of my dignity. I would cut her off. The phrase itself seemed foreign, even cruel, because for 76 years I had defined myself by what I could give, not what I could deny. But the more I repeated it silently, I will cut her off, the more I felt a strange calm spreading through me, as though I were finally stepping onto solid ground after years of sinking sand. Of course, fear accompanied it too. Fear of what she would say. Fear of being utterly alone without even the pretense of family. Fear of the guilt she would no doubt try to heap upon me. Yet beneath the fear was something else, something sharper. Relief. For the first time in years, the possibility of living the rest of my life on my own terms, without being constantly diminished, glimmered like a light I thought had gone out forever. That afternoon, I took a small, almost symbolic step. I walked into the bank where the teller still recognized me, and I asked to speak with a manager. I told her that I wanted to make changes, to close an old joint account that Claire and I had once shared when she was in college, an account that had been left open all these years out of habit, and through which she had sometimes helped herself, without asking. The manager raised an eyebrow, reminded me that closing it would mean she could no longer access the funds. "That's the idea," I said quietly, and my voice surprised me with its steadiness. Signing the papers felt like crossing a threshold. It was not the money itself, though that mattered too. It was the act of reclaiming control, of saying that I was not simply a resource to be mined until nothing remained. When I walked out into the sunlight again, the air felt different, cleaner, as though the world had shifted slightly on its axis. That night, as I sat once more at the table with the shrinking cake, I realized I was not mourning the loss of my daughter's affection, because in truth it had been gone for a long time, but mourning the illusion I had carried, the illusion that someday she would remember who I was to her, that someday she would treat me with the warmth she once did as a child. Letting go of that illusion hurt more than her words, because it meant admitting that the family I longed for no longer existed. But in the same breath, it also meant I was free to shape whatever remained of my life without waiting for scraps of love that would never come. That was the midpoint, the crisis that stripped away the last of my denial. The realization that my daughter had already cut me off in every way that mattered, and that the only thing left for me to do was to make it official, to accept it, and to act on it. The day after I closed the account, I woke with the peculiar calm that follows a sleepless night. The kind of calm that is not peace, but the exhaustion of a man who has decided to stop pleading with a door that will not open. And yet the world did not. Wait for me to gather strength, because the world never does. So I made coffee and tried to let the steam on my glasses be the worst indignity I suffered before noon. And for a few quiet minutes I believed I might carry this new resolve like a hidden talisman. Then the doorbell rang with an insistence that belonged not to neighbors or delivery men, but to people who think they are owed entry. And when I opened it, there stood Claire, not with flowers or an apology, but with her purse clamped under her arm like a briefcase and a hard set to her mouth that I recognized from the years when she learned that anger draws blood faster than tears. She swept past me without waiting to be invited and began speaking before I had finished closing the door, telling me that I had humiliated her, that the bank had called to alert her that the old account was shut, that I had blindsided her on a day when she had real problems, and I asked her to sit, to breathe, to speak to me like a daughter, to a father. But she remained standing, glaring as if I were a landlord raising the rent, and she delivered the phrase that announced the second movement of this grim symphony. If you're going to act like a child, then I'll have to treat you like one. I told her I was tired of being reduced to an ATM with a pulse, that the constant demands had eroded what little closeness we still had, that closing the account was not an attack, but a boundary I should have set long ago. And I watched her eyes flick, calculating, not toward my face, but toward the desk where I keep my papers. And I understood with a cold clarity that she had come not for conversation, but for access. When I refused to open the drawer, she shifted tactics with a cruel agility, asking loudly whether I had taken my medication, whether I remembered what day it was, whether I was eating, and she began circling the room, lifting the lid of the garbage, can to peer in as if she were collecting evidence for a case I was not yet aware of. I told her to stop, that she was not a social worker, and she announced that perhaps she should call one, that perhaps it was time a professional evaluated my living situation. And I stared at my spotless kitchen and the tidy stack of bills paid on, the counter, and wondered what disarray she saw except the kind she intended to create. She left with the promise that I would regret my selfishness, and by mid-afternoon the knock on the door was no longer a daughter's fist, but the polite rap of a uniformed officer accompanied by a woman with a clipboard who introduced herself from Adult Protective Services. They had received an anonymous tip, she said with bureaucratic gentleness, about a vulnerable senior who might be neglecting himself, and would I mind if they looked around? I minded very much, but I also knew that refusing would only fan suspicion. So I let them in and endured the tour of my own life as if I were a tenant being inspected, pointing out the stocked refrigerator, the labeled pill organizer, the smoke, detectors with fresh batteries, each ordinary object suddenly transformed into a defense exhibit. The officer's face softened. The woman checked off boxes and apologized for the intrusion. But the shame did not leave when they did. It lingered like smoke, the knowledge that my daughter had invited strangers to judge me while she refused to see me. The next blow arrived in paper form, a thick envelope from a credit company I had never used, thanking me for opening a line of credit 6 months prior and informing me I was 60 days late on the minimum payment. I sat at the table with that letter and felt the world tilt slightly, as if the floor had shifted, because the signature on the application form enclosed was mine, and yet not mine, a clumsy mimic of my name that captured the broad strokes, but none of the rhythm of a hand that has signed taxes and birthday cards for half a century. I called the number, waded through the bright music of recorded cheerfulness, and filed the fraud report that made my mouth taste metallic. And then I pulled every file from my drawer, spread them across the table until the wood disappeared under a grid of my life, and began checking for other anomalies. And I found them. A store card from an electronics retailer in a city I have not visited since Reagan was president. A medical bill with my address, but a clinic I had never heard of, and the sour thought rose that this was not random theft, but close-in betrayal. The kind that requires your mother's maiden name and your first dog and the street where you grew up. I wanted to tell myself that it could not be Claire, that perhaps my mailbox had been rifled or some database had been hacked, but denial is a kind of anesthesia, and it was wearing off, because the dates aligned too neatly with her emergencies. And I recalled the afternoon months earlier when she arrived with a stack of forms she said were insurance updates, how she had pressed me to sign quickly because she was late for a meeting, how I had not put on my glasses because I was embarrassed by how long it takes me to focus, how she had gathered the pages and smiled thinly when I asked for copies, promising to email them and never doing so. I felt heat behind my eyes, anger rising not as a flash, but as a slow, volcanic surge that threatened to overflow. And I stood and paced and whispered an apology to Lavina for not seeing sooner, for not guarding better the legacy we built. To test whether I was imagining patterns, I went to the grocery store, seeking the distraction of ordinary errands. But Claire called while I was in the cereal aisle, her voice amplified by the speaker button I fumbled to turn off, telling me that if I did not transfer the $10,000 by end of day, she would be forced to take steps I wouldn't like. And when I asked what steps those were, she said she would file for conservatorship because it was clear I was no longer capable of making sound decisions. And she said it loud enough that an older couple pushing a cart glanced over, and something in me snapped, and I told her she could try whatever she wished, that I would be waiting with documentation, that I was not the confused old man she was painting to the world. And the couple looked away quickly, as if they had stumbled into a family argument that might stain them. I ended the call and stood there with my hand on a box of oatmeal that Lavina used to buy. And I realized the banal cruelty of what was happening, how humiliation is easier to wield in public because shame thrives on witnesses. And I gripped the cart until the tremor in my fingers steadied. That evening brought an email, not a message crafted in heat, but something cooler and calculated, a list of conditions under the subject line. Next steps, in which Claire stated that she would refrain from petitioning the court if I gave her limited control over my accounts for my own protection, signed a new durable power of attorney she had attached as a PDF, and agreed to sell my house within the next 90 days so I could transition into an assisted living community better suited to my needs. She wrote that she had spoken to a notary who could come by the following week, that she had already toured 2 facilities, that she was doing this because she cared, and that if I continued to be unreasonable, she would have no choice but to involve professionals. The words were as bald as they were sinister, and for a long minute I simply watched the cursor blink in the reply window, that tiny metronome measuring out the remaining patience of my life. I did not reply to her. I wrote instead to an attorney whose card I had kept in a kitchen drawer, a man named Rowan, who had handled a neighbor's probate, and who had once spoken at the senior center about scams that begin with love and end with signatures. He called me back the next morning, listened without interruption, while I laid out the bitter map the past week, and then in a voice that did not pity but steadied, he said we would proceed methodically. Freeze and monitor all credit, file police, reports for the fraudulent accounts, notify the 3 bureaus, place a passcode on my bank profile, and prepare a letter revoking any old permissions Claire might try to wave like a flag of authority. He asked whether I had ever signed a power of attorney, even years ago during surgery or illness. And I remembered a single-page form from the hospital when Lavina had her biopsy. Something we signed hurriedly because the nurse said it was routine. And Rowan hummed softly, the sound of someone tracing a fault line, and told me to bring everything I had to his office and not to speak to Claire until we had our pieces on the board. On my way to see him, I made the mistake of stopping by Claire's house with a small bag of books her sons had left at mine. thinking some gesture of normalcy might pierce the fog. But the front door opened not to grandchildren, but to Claire herself, flanked by her husband, and the look on her face told me I had walked into a theater where the script was already written. She invited me in with a politeness as brittle as spun sugar, offered coffee she did not intend to pour, and announced that they had consulted an elder care specialist who agreed that my cognitive state was concerning, a conclusion she supported by misremembered anecdotes delivered as proof. The time I left my keys in the freezer, which was actually the time I moved them while defrosting roast. The time I forgot the twins' birthdays, which were in fact celebrated with checks I could produce. The time I wandered off during a family outing and had to be found, which was a picnic where I walked to the lake to cry for 10 minutes because Lavina's absence had knocked the wind out of me. Each misrepresentation slotted into place like bricks in a wall she was building to push me behind. And when I tried to speak, she raised a palm and said she was done being manipulated by my performances. In that sterile living room, I saw more clearly than ever what had happened to my daughter. How fear and debt and a long habit of choosing the easier story had hardened into certainty. How she had become someone to whom ends justified means, because ends looked like survival. And I realized that asking her for love was like asking a drought for rain. It is not cruelty alone that keeps the sky empty, but a climate that has shifted so gradually you forget what clouds can do. She confessed, not quite directly, but in the words she chose, that her husband had lost a contract months back, that the bank had been unfair about grace periods, that tuition bills had come all at once, that she had covered things by taking on temporary credit. And she shot me a look that said temporary has a way of becoming permanent when the numbers don't love you. I understood then that my birthday request for a cake had collided with her fear of collapse, that my refusal now felt to her like treason because she had already spent money I had not given her in the currency of expectations. When I stood to leave, she blocked the doorway with a final salvo, telling me that if I continued to be obstinate, she would tell the boys that I had chosen money over family, that I had abandoned them, and the word struck with a force I was not prepared for, because they weaponized the very image that had sustained me through lonely nights. The picture of my grandsons coming to sit at my table, eating pancakes, asking me about the old records, letting me believe I would not end my days as a ghost in my own house. I told her she could tell them whatever she wished. The truth has a way of showing itself eventually. But I could hear my own voice wobble, and she smiled with a satisfaction that frightened me. I left without the books because she had not let me hand them over. And for the first time since Lavina's funeral, I had to pull to the side of the road and sit until the shaking passed. The following morning, the neighbor from across the street knocked to tell me, with the halting kindness of someone who knows gossip hurts, that Claire had posted on a local community page about the heartbreaking challenges of dealing with an aging parent in denial. And my name was not there, but enough identifying details were that any mutual acquaintance would understand. And the comments bloomed with advice and judgments and the smugness of people who mistake certainty for wisdom. I closed the laptop and stood very still until the room stopped spinning. And then I took a pen and a pad of paper and began writing not a reply to the mob nor a plea to my daughter, but a list of the life I had left. The house deed, still in my name, a loan, the pension checks that arrived on the first, the friends whose numbers I had allowed to go stale, the church I drifted from after Lavina died, the skills I still possessed for balancing accounts and reading fine print. The list was longer than I expected, and as the lines filled, I felt something like muscle returning to a limb I thought was lost. By the time I met Rowan that afternoon, the second escalation had done its cruel work, and also its necessary one. It had stripped me of the illusion that I could buy my way back into my daughter's warmth. It had forced me into the light, where decisions have to be taken. It had showed me the shape of the enemy, and also the shape of myself. Not the tired supplicant, but the man who had once navigated audits and mortgages and the razor edges of life without dropping the people he loved. We signed letters and affidavits. We set freezes and alerts. We scheduled a cognitive evaluation not because I doubted my mind, but because I refused to let anyone else define it. And when I walked out of his office into the late sun, the air felt like a stern blessing. I knew worse was coming, because people do not surrender myths about themselves easily, and Claire's myth required me to be helpless and guilty. But I also knew that the ground under my feet had hardened, that the next time the doorbell rang, or a clipboard appeared, or a lie tried to shift my history, I would stand straighter. And I would speak with the authority a father earns, not by being perfect, but by surviving what love does to a man when love forgets him. The confrontation I had feared came sooner than expected. And by then the weeks of preparation had hardened me into someone I barely recognized. A man who no longer trembled at the sound of his daughter's voice, but instead measured it like a banker. Assessing counterfeit bills, the morning was gray, the kind of morning that smells of rain before it falls. When I heard the pounding on the door that could only belong to Claire, I opened it, not timidly, but deliberately, and there she stood, not alone, but flanked by her husband, both of them bristling with the fury of people who have lost their grip on control. She did not wait for invitation. She stormed into the living room and accused me of betrayal, of cruelty, of destroying her life, as if the decision to protect myself were nothing less than an act of war against her existence. I listened, silent at first, my hands resting on the back of a chair. And when she paused long enough to demand an answer, I told her calmly that she had forced my hand, that years of lies and manipulation had cornered me into a place where survival required severing the tie that had once been sacred. Her face twisted with disbelief, and she shouted that I had no right, that I was old, confused, incapable, and that the courts would see it her way. Thornton stood there nodding, smirking with the arrogance of a man who thinks paperwork and intimidation can erase decades of lived truth. But what they did not know was that I had already anticipated their moves, that I had prepared every document, secured every account, and fortified myself with professional allies who recognized the clarity of my mind, even if my own daughter refused. 2. When I handed them the envelope containing copies of legal filings, the revoked access to my accounts, the notarized statement of capacity, the pending action on the property they coveted, there was a silence so deep that I could hear the ticking of the old wall clock like a drumbeat of judgment. Claire tore the papers open, scanned them with widening eyes, and then flung them onto the floor as if by scattering them she could scatter the reality they represented. The climax was not in the shouting that followed, but in the sudden shift of power that neither of them could disguise. For the first time in decades, I was not defending myself, but declaring terms. I told them, without raising my voice, that they had taken from me not only money but dignity, companionship, and trust, and that this theft was more unforgivable than any dollar figure. I told them that the day Claire said I did not deserve a birthday cake, she had revealed the naked truth of how little I meant to her, and that since then I had decided to reclaim whatever years remained by refusing to live as her captive. Thornton tried to interject, muttering that family means compromise, but I cut him off with a force I did not know still lived in me. No, I said. Family means loyalty, respect, and love. Compromise without those things is slavery. The words hung in the air, sharp as glass, and even Claire could not pretend not to hear them. When she realized that threats would not bend me, she switched to pleading, her voice softening, her eyes welling with the kind of tears that once would have melted me. She begged me not to destroy what was left of our family, reminded me that I was her only parent left, that the grandchildren would hate me if they learned what I had done. It was a performance, one I had seen in different forms since she was a teenager. But now, in the harsh light of betrayal, it rang hollow. I told her that I had already lost the family I cherished, that the children she mentioned had been absent from my life for years, and that it was not I who had erased those bonds, but she, when she chose deceit over truth. Her tears dried as quickly as they had appeared, replaced once again by rage, and she hissed that I would die alone, bitter and unloved. Perhaps, I said, but I would die free, and freedom was a gift no child, however ungrateful, could take from me again. There was no dramatic exit, no slammed doors or thrown objects. They simply left, muttering dark promises of revenge, and I stood in the quiet house breathing heavily, the weight of years pressing down and lifting all at once. The climax had not destroyed me. It had remade me. For so long I had lived in the shadow of their demands, convinced that age made me weak, that loneliness made me powerless. But now I understood that survival is not about clinging to those who wound you, but about daring to let go. I sank into the armchair by the window, the rain finally beginning to fall outside, and I felt not triumphant, but steady, as if the storm had passed and left the air cleaner, sharper, filled with possibility. My daughter's words still rang in my ears, but instead of piercing me, they sounded distant, like echoes from a place I no longer lived. I realized, as the clock marked the closing of that long and brutal confrontation, that I had chosen my own ending. It would not be the ending of a man erased by neglect, nor of a father drained to the bone by endless sacrifice, but of someone who had finally drawn the line and said, "Enough." And in that realization, painful and liberating, lay the true culmination of my story. In the weeks after the storm, I discovered that endings do not happen in a single loud moment, but arrive in careful layers, each one settling over the last until the noise is gone and the shape of a new life stands there in plain daylight. Because the first layer was simply administrative closure when the Adult Protective Services caseworker mailed a polite letter saying the file was closed for lack of concern, and the second layer was the bank's notice confirming my passcode locks and the removal of every permission but my own, and the third layer was a quiet morning at Rowan's office, where we signed a fresh will and a medical directive and a durable power of attorney that placed any future decisions in the hands of a neutral fiduciary who answers to the court rather than to guilt. And in that same meeting I instructed him to establish the Levi Nahalis Memorial Scholarship at the community college for students who work while caring for aging relatives. Because if money had been the weapon used against me, then I wanted money to become the instrument of my answer. And I felt Lavina's approval in the way my shoulders finally loosened after months of bracing for the next blow. Word came that the credit bureaus had reversed the fraudulent accounts and flagged my file for extra verification. The police detective filed a report that may never lead anywhere but still recorded the truth in official ink. And when Claire filed her conservatorship petition with affidavits dressed in misremembered stories, the judge ordered an independent cognitive evaluation that I took in a room bright with clean winter light, where I recited lists and solved little puzzles and traced a clock face with hands steady enough to draw the minute ticks. And a month later, the court denied her petition with language as gentle as it was final, noting my competence and consistent, reasoned financial planning. And I folded that order and placed it beneath the scholarship certificate in a drawer that no one but me now opens. It turned out that quiet was not emptiness, but space, and into that space came routines that did not ask me to plead for permission. I returned to church on Thursdays because the potluck line is kinder than silence. I started helping the librarian on Mondays with the donation shelf because I still know my alphabet and decimals. I learned the names of the robins that scatter across my yard in the hour before dusk, and I slept through the night for the first time in years, not because age had reversed or grief had vanished, but because dread had finally been evicted from the house. I wrote a letter to Claire that I rewrote a dozen times, until the words were neither a shout nor a surrender. A letter without accusations and without openings for manipulation. 3 simple pages that said I wished her health and steadiness, that I would not be sending money now or later. That reconciliation was possible only if it began with truth spoken plainly and not as performance. That any future meeting would be in Rowan's office with a recorder running. And I put the letter in the mail, the way a man places a stone on a grave, not to wake the dead, but to mark that he remembered and that he is still walking. Weeks passed and there was no reply. And I discovered that the absence of an answer is an answer that hurts less each day. I wrote a different letter to the boys and placed in the envelope a copy of their grandmother's pancake recipe written in her round blue script, and a note that told them where to find the old Sinatra record if they ever wanted it. And I promised that if they chose to visit, they would find a chair and a plate and a story waiting. And months later, a single postcard arrived from a dorm in another state, with 3 sentences that said school was hard and music helped, and love to Grandpa. And those 20 words were enough to soften a corner of the world that had grown very hard, not because they promised a future, but because they were written in the uncoached hand of a young man who, for 10 minutes in a strange city, chose kindness over inheritance politics. The next birthday came around almost without my noticing, and when I did notice, I smiled at the memory of last year's humiliation, because memory is a muscle that grows less tender with use. And I decided to bake a cake the way Lavina taught me, not for guests I could not count on, but for the people who had shown up when I needed them. The neighbor who quietly mowed the strip of lawn I can no longer manage. The teller who slipped me a list of steps after the fraud report and said she was proud of me. The librarian who saved the large print biographies because she knew I still liked to learn. The pastor who asked no questions when I said I only wanted to stack chairs. And I set the cake on the table with paper plates and a box of little candles, and I wrote on the frosting with a clumsy hand, not happy birthday, because I no longer chase happiness, but glad you're still here. And we ate in the uncomplicated rhythm of people who do not need each other to be anything other than what we are. Later, I cut one small slice, wrapped it in wax paper, and drove to the cemetery where the snow had receded to a lace collar around the stones. And I sat on the bench and told Lavina that I had done the hard thing she would have asked me to do, that I had finally chosen dignity over longing, that our love had not been rewritten by anyone's convenience. And for a long while there was only wind in the cedar and the weight of a hand I could not hold, except by remembering it exactly. When I came home, the house did not feel empty. It felt orderly, the way a ledger feels when the numbers at last balance. And I understood that justice, when it arrives late, is not a trumpet, but a settled page. I do not pretend that I won, because life is not a trial with a single verdict. And I do not pretend that it no longer aches, because love leaves a bruise that no salve erases. But I live now without begging and without bracing, and I keep the scholarship certificate on the wall near the kitchen where the morning light warms it first. And on days when the phone is quiet and the sky is generous, I pour 2 cups of coffee out of habit and take one to the window. And I speak my wife's name. And I tell myself the truth I should have learned sooner, that a man's worth is not measured in what is demanded of him, but in what he refuses to surrender, and that if no one brings a cake again, I will still have flour and eggs and sugar and the recipe in her hand, and I will still be here, and I will still deserve to be celebrated, even if the person doing the celebrating is me.